So to get started, hopefully everybody, like I said, is able to hear just some logistics right now. We'll be covering two documents primarily, and that's the 2019 Clean Transit Bus Request for Applications, as well as the 2019 Clean Transit Bus Application Form that's associated with the RFA. So for the agenda, we'll give an overview of the RFA, including the schedule, eligible projects, cost share requirements, and other details. And then the remainder of the time will be available for all of your questions associated with this funding opportunity. You can submit questions at any time by clicking on the instant message icon bubble on the lower left-hand side of the screen, or by asking them over the phone when the time comes for questions at the end of the presentation. For today, it's myself. My name's Kyla Mackey. I'm with the Energy Office at the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. We also have here Bill Webb, who is with the Energy Office, as well as Dan Lloyd, and we can try to answer your questions. I'll be going through the presentation on the overview of the RFA. I think that covers most of the logistics. Everybody's line is going to be muted except for mine until the time for questions come. But you can, like I said, you can type in questions at any time in that message, through that instant message icon, and we'll get those and try to answer those over the phone. So some general background on the funding opportunity, the request for applications. We're making $2.5 million available for clean transit bus replacements. This is only a portion of Montana's total allocation under the Volkswagen Environmental Mitigation. Montana is receiving a total of $12.6 million. There will be other funding opportunities for other types of projects, including electric vehicle charging stations and other vehicle replacements. This is a multi-year program. It's just one part of our overall clean transit program through the Department of Environmental Quality that's intended to spend the funds under the Volkswagen Environmental Mitigation Settlement. So the application deadline for the first round of funding is 5 p.m. on Wednesday, March 27th, 2019. So about a month from now. We will determine if there will be subsequent funding rounds based on the funds that are available after the first round. If there aren't funds available or not sufficient funds available, then we won't open it up for additional rounds. The schedule for the additional funding rounds for the deadlines is on page 4 of the request for applications. The applications and associated materials and required materials can be submitted to Bill Webb at the email address there. So in addition to the Clean Transit Bus application form, which the link is at the beginning of this presentation, will also require a few additional materials. So the application, a copy of the existing transit bus title, so the bus that you'll be replacing, a clear photo of the engine label for each bus proposed for replacement, a photo of the vehicle identification number plate that includes the gross vehicle weight rating for each bus that's proposed for replacement, and then 3 different bids for replacement transit bus and charging equipment or infrastructure. If you're not able to provide 3 separate bids from vendors due to various circumstances, just provide a letter as to why you can't provide those 3 different bids. and also a letter of commitment for the required match. I'll go into the matching requirements in a little bit here, and the transit bus retirement policy for your organization. Just to note that a separate application is required for each bus that you're proposing to replace. So a little bit on the eligibility of applicants and eligibility of projects. Eligible applicants were defined in the Volkswagen Environmental Mitigation Settlement. For federal entities, it was up to the state beneficiaries whether the federal projects would come under government or non-government classification, and this is important because of specific matching requirements that are laid out in the settlement that are different for government and non-government entities. But so for Montana's purposes, a government entity is any federal, state, local government, schools, transit districts, special districts, tribes. Those are all government entities. Non-government entities are any for-profit or business or nonprofit organization. So eligible projects, this is probably what folks are most interested in. So it must be a replacement project of a new transit bus with an old transit bus. And we've gotten a few questions on what's qualifies as a transit bus. In the RFA, it does state that a transit bus is those that are used in frequent stop service. And so there's certain types of buses that may be used to transport people long distances. That would may be used for school activities or other types of charter services. Those, unfortunately, are not eligible under this opportunity. But again, there may be other opportunities where we would fund those projects under school buses or other types of bus replacements. So this is just for transit buses. It can be any transit buses in class 4 through 8, which is defined, and this is in the settlement, as anything that's 14,001 pounds or greater. The new transit bus is required to be in the same vehicle class as the old bus. There has been some questions I've seen in other states about whether the new transit bus can actually be in a smaller class than the old transit bus, because you would see fuel savings there. I think that's something that we'd have to discuss here, but the purpose of this is more about to avoid replacing our fleet expansion, which is replacing something smaller with something larger. Then you wouldn't be seeing the emissions benefits primarily with a larger bus replacement. On the engine model year, it's on the old bus, it's anything from 1992 to 2009, with a preference for any bus you're replacing that's 2006 or newer. The idea there is that after 2007, the emissions ratings requirements for the vehicles in this class increased at the federal level. So just trying to gain as many emissions benefits as possible. And then for the new transit bus, anything 2018 and newer. For the fuel and technology, the old bus would need to be a diesel bus. And then this is an important piece on this, is that any new transit bus would either have to be all electric or alternate fueled. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that, but essentially we are not funding diesel for diesel replacements under this opportunity. And then other requirements that we've included, and I have gotten a couple questions on this, is that any bus that's not scheduled for retirement, old bus that's not scheduled for retirement before December 31st, 2022. So this is a requirement that we have in our existing Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, or DERA, funding through the EPA. It's something that we had put in this opportunity because of trying to avoid projects that would have occurred without this funding. Anyways, this is something we can discuss further as applications come in. It's a criteria that I hope that entities doesn't prevent you or stop you from applying. And the retirement schedule is something that would go in the letter of commitment for match, as well as whatever the retirement schedule is for the entity that's applying. So I can answer questions about that as well. And then the new transit bus needs to operate in the project area for at least 7 years, so that we're guaranteeing that we're getting those benefits in the project area that's defined at the time of application. So ineligible projects, I mentioned fleet expansion, so that again, that's replacing a vehicle that's in a smaller class with a vehicle that's in a larger class. Any buses or charging equipment that are purchased before this grant agreement or the contract is associated with this RFA is signed. Any transit buses and or related fueling technologies that are not commercially available, rebuilds of existing vehicles, repowered or remanufactured engines. Those are requirements under the settlement, that these funds can't go towards rebuilds or repowers. Charter bus replacement or school bus replacement. This is the cost share requirements under the RFA. And so the goal here was we looked at the average cost of a bus for each of the electric or alternative fuel technologies, and wanted to make the cost that's required, the cost share that's required for the applicant, as close to a new diesel bus as possible. And so there is more funding available, and this again is guidelines from the settlement, but there is more funding available for electric transit bus replacements. And then with government applicants, there's more funding available for government versus the non-government applicants. So you can see there that we're funding 60% of the cost of the bus, or $475,000 for each bus replacement, whichever is less. And then the cost share on the applicant would be 40%. And then associated with the electric bus is an allowance under the settlement for funding charging infrastructure that's directly associated with that bus. And that would be the funding available is 60% of the cost of the charging infrastructure, or $50,000, whichever is less. The maximum total award per applicant for government applicants for electric replacements is $1 million. So the idea here was that an applicant could apply for 2 electric buses and receive that funding, and the maximum total award would be $1 million. For non-government applicants, the cost share is a bit higher at 50% for entities, and then 50% of the cost of the charging infrastructure, and then $850,000 for the maximum award. On the electric hybrid bus, so these are the diesel electric hybrid replacements. The funding limits are per bus or 40% or $200,000, whichever is less for government applicants. Applicant cost share per bus is 60%, and the maximum total award per applicant is $400,000. And then for non-government applicants, it's 25% or $127,500, whichever is less. 75% of the cost share per bus or $255,000 maximum award. And then finally, the cost share requirements for the alternative fuel. So this would primarily include compressed natural gas, CNG buses, but it could also in some cases include propane buses. So the funding limit per bus is 20% or $70,000, whichever is less for government, 80% cost share required from the applicant, and the maximum total award per applicant is $140,000. For non-government applicants, 15% or $54,000, whichever is less, and then 85% cost share requirement for the applicant and $108,000 maximum award. So some of our priorities when we're under this funding opportunity, these again come from the RFA, but they were developed from our state beneficiary mitigation plan. Provide a link to that at the end of this presentation. And then they also come from guidance from the settlement. So these inform our project selection and scoring criteria. So greatest amount of lifetime NOx emission reductions, those projects that are located in priority counties and air quality areas. I'll cover where those are at. Buses with higher annual bus ridership, so benefiting the greatest number of people, replacing buses that use greater amounts of diesel fuel on an annual basis, those that result in lower annual estimated greenhouse gas emissions, projects that replace buses with lower total mileage, so that's on the odometer reading. Again, that gets at funding going towards projects that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. And then projects operating in sensitive areas and serving sensitive populations. That's a little different than the priority counties and priority air quality areas. That's kind of more of a location-specific demographic and environmental indicators, and there's a tool for that through the EPA for your project that's noted at the end of this presentation, as well as in the RFA that we'll use to look at where those sensitive areas and sensitive populations are within the state. And then projects completed within 20 months of the contract execution date. I note that that's 20 months, I believe, in the application form. It says 18, and in the RFA it says, in the request for application it says 20 months. It is 20 months. So the project timeline, we prefer those that can be completed before the end of 2 years. And then, so for our priority air quality areas, those are any counties with areas that are in non-attainment, at risk, and maintenance, meaning that they were once in non-attainment, for certain air pollutants associated with mobile sources. Also associated with stationary sources, but EPA, this list comes from EPA as well as DEQ's own list that we're considering the impacts of the air pollution in certain areas of the state. Also includes eligible Class 1 areas, which would be Glacier and Yellowstone National Parks, Fort Peck Reservation, Northern Cheyenne Reservation, and the Flathead Reservation. And then finally, the other counties that are priorities for us through this funding are those top 10 counties that have the highest mobile sources of total on-road NOx emissions. Have gotten a couple questions about why we didn't just look at counties with total mobile source NOx emissions. The goal there was, since this specific RFA is to replace transit buses, which are on-road vehicles, that we would try to target those that have the highest on-road emissions. So for the project scoring criteria matrix, this is Appendix A of the RFA. This, as I stated, reflects our priorities under the Volkswagen settlement that's in our beneficiary mitigation plan. There are low, medium, or high point potential totals for each criterion, and that's then calculated by the weight for that criterion to get a total number of points. The maximum points for each criterion are between 15 and 25 points. There are specific questions that are on that RFA application form, and that corresponds to each of those project scoring criterion. And there are some additional tools and resources. There's the link to the settlement, the link to our beneficiary mitigation plan, which gives kind of a high-level overview of how we intend to spend the $12.6 million. And then in addition, the Argonne National Labs A-Fleet tool. This can be used to calculate estimated lifetime NOx emissions, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions criteria. And then finally, there's the EPA's, it's called the Environmental Justice Screening, or EJ Screen tool. It provides kind of a snapshot. You can look based on your location of how a specific location might compare to the rest of the state for certain demographic and environmental risk factors. And so we'll compare projects based on that and assign points. So I think that's all I had for an overview. I'm sure there's some questions. I don't think I've gotten any questions in the chat box, but we can open it up on the phone. Here, let me do that right now. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so the line should be open. If folks have questions, we can try to answer them. If we can't get you a definitive answer today, we'll try to follow up through email. You can email Bill or myself, but is there any questions? Hello?
This is Rusty Logan from Met Transit with the City Billings. So I just wanted to clarify, so as far as the vehicles that were retiring, you're saying they can't be eligible for retirement prior to December of 22?
So yeah, I can hear you. If your retirement policy for your buses has a certain vehicle retiring after a certain number of years or a certain number of miles, and that retirement date, or based on the mileage, is going to be before December 31st, 2022, then under the guidelines of the RFA, it wouldn't be eligible, but maybe Bill, you could expand on that.
Well, we're just looking for a service life of 3 years beyond start of the project date. And so that lines up with, what was the date you had on there? January 31st, 2022.
Okay, so that falls into, you want the project completed within those 3 years, or you want it committed within those 3 years? What are you guys asking for, I guess, on that end of things then?
No, we're just looking to see that the vehicle being replaced would have a service life 3 years beyond the start of the project date. So that is January 31st, 2022. And so when you submit your retirement policy letter, then we'll look to see when you would have normally retired that bus, and it should be after January 31st, 2022.
Okay. So overall, I guess, so I understand you guys are looking to replace vehicles that would already have clean emissions equipment on them for the diesel power plants. But I guess the concern that I have about it is that this kind of flies in direct contrast to what the Federal Transit Administration would require us to do with our retirement policy. Because we would then, I mean, I might be misunderstanding what you guys are saying, but it sounds like we would be trying to retire a bus earlier than what the Federal Transit Administration would want us to retire it, because we'd be retiring a bus that was still within its useful life.
Well, it's supposed to be an early retirement program. So we want to make sure that there's still useful life on the bus, at least 3 years worth. So,
okay.
It's not an old bus retirement program.
Okay.
We're looking for these funds going towards an early retirement of this bus to get it off the road to save emissions.
Yeah, this is Dan. So I understand what you're saying here. This is a little bit different program than what you were referring to. The aim of this program is to reduce emissions by replacing existing buses with cleaner buses and incentivizing that replacement to happen sooner than it would otherwise happen, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying is it kind of presents a difficulty for probably a number of the transit agencies that rely upon federal funding for their capital replacement of their buses, because we would have to then work with the FTA to get approval to, we'd have to have a viable reason to retire that bus. And I understand emissions and so forth with that. So it's just a question that we would in turn probably have to raise with someone from FTA so that we could get clarification on how that process would work. So I just wanted to make sure I was understanding so that if, we decide to pursue it, I can go to FTA and ask how we would go about doing this.
Yeah, thanks, Rusty. It's like I said, it's a question that has come up, and I think, one of the challenges is that the settlement lays out buses that are between 1992 and 2006, and it's not, based on those ages, it's not likely that, it's likely that those buses would probably be retired in the next 3 years. And so I think that is one of the challenges of that requirement. And maybe Rusty, I think you have my email, maybe you can send me that FTA policy. That might be helpful for us to understand. We require this for school bus replacements, like I said, under our DERA program, but there may be some different unique differences between that and the FTA and transit funding.
Okay. Yeah, I'll see. I'll gather up some information and get it sent over to you, because that's just that would be one of the concerns that we would run into, because it's I've got a bunch of 2004s and 2005s that fall within FTA retirement guidelines. But if I turn around and try and retire a bus that's still within its useful life, then I have to have a good reason as to why I'm taking a bus that's funded with FTA funds off the road when it's still got usable life on it. So I'll see if I can find those specific circulars and get them sent over to you. Okay.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I think, I'm not saying that we're taking that requirement out just because, yeah, we are trying to avoid replacing a vehicle that would have been replaced otherwise. And like Dan said, this is, for not an old bus, already going to be replaced program. But no, I appreciate that comment.
This is Corey Aldridge, Mountain Line of Missoula. Let me add on to that. What you're setting us up to do with this requirement is asking us to retire buses that are in better shape than old buses and get those out of our fleet and keep the buses that are putting out more emissions, essentially, because we're not going to replace buses unless we have the money to do it. And so our oldest buses is what we want to replace first, but based on this, we would have to replace newer buses and keep the older buses, which are considerably more polluting than the newer buses.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to consider that. I understand that. Again, this wasn't a requirement under the settlement, so it's something we have flexibility on, but we need to just make sure that we're being consistent and meeting the goals of our program. Like I said, it's something we do with school buses, and so I don't think we've run into the issue of school buses running really old buses and then, not using our funding to replace those. But I'll get to some, I'll get to some questions that have come through the chat box. So there's one question, is Yellowstone National Park considered a Montana-based national park for the purpose of this opportunity? Initially, when we were designing the program, I did have some conversations with Wyoming because they have received the same type of questions. I think if the bus operates in Montana at all, then it probably would be eligible for our funding. There's opportunities for us to combine funding with Wyoming, but this particular opportunity doesn't provide for that. So I guess the short answer to that is if it operates in Montana at all, then yes, we would like to see projects in that part of the state. Again, it's a Class 1 airshed, so some important considerations there. I would say just apply for the funding and we'll kind of determine where that bus would be operating and if it at all includes an area in Montana. Okay, any other questions on the phone?
Yeah, Kyle, I just
Hi, Kyle.
wanted
This
to
is Jordan
clarify
Hess
one
from Missoula.
Oh, hi. Hi.
How are you? I've got a question about upgrading within the class ranges. I know that the presentation mentioned that buses must stay within the class that's being retired. Are there any scenarios in which upgrading a vehicle could be permitted with a different cost share, or with, or I guess are there scenarios where an application could contemplate upgrading within the classes?
Do you have kind of a specific example?
Yeah, I guess we have some medium duty transit buses that were, sort of the type of vehicle that we would purchase back in the day, and our system characteristics have just changed over the years, where we're now purchasing heavier duty buses that are with a longer vehicle life. And so, in terms of passenger load, it's not going to be a tremendous difference. It's just going to be a more robust vehicle in terms of what we would be replacing it with.
Yeah, I think I mean, I think my short answer to that is no. We do want to avoid the fleet expansion, and I think that just gets us into some questions of whether we're even seeing savings. I think with electric bus replacements, there can be significant savings, but if you're, if we kind of open the door to increasing in the class size of the vehicle, then that might just kind of undermine some of those benefits.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, and I probably need to do a little bit more research into the specific class levels, and I might follow up later with a more specific question.
Okay, that sounds good.
Great, thank you.
Was there another question when I think Jordan was chiming in?
Yeah, Kyla, this is Rusty in Billings again. I just wanted to reiterate kind of what Corey was saying. The thing with that we especially face, which I'm sure Corey does in Missoula as well as Jim out in Great Falls, with our vehicle replacements, we're actually in competitive processes most of the time with each other in order to get funds to replace these vehicles. So that's why most entities that are probably receiving funds from the Federal Transit Administration aren't tripping over themselves to replace buses that are within useful life. So I'll follow up with you again later too if you need some further explanation of it, but you're most likely going to run into that we're not going to be, I can't foresee any of the 5307s going out to jump on this opportunity just because of that, because most of us run into the funding issues with we don't have enough money to do the capital replacements, and we supplement any type of assistance that we would have already received from the Federal Transit Administration with local projects such as this. So I just wanted you to have a little bit more background on that, but I'll definitely follow up with you here after the webinar at a later time too.
Okay, yeah, that would be really helpful for just our learning and understanding of existing programs. This is a new program, so we're in many ways we're learning as we go. If it's not a requirement in the settlement, like I said, we do have some flexibility. I just want to make sure that we're still meeting the goals of kind of similar programs that we have, as well as stated goals of this program. But yeah, I appreciate more information and follow up, and if we do make adjustments to this requirement, we'll definitely change the RFA and send out a notice to the list.
And this is Dan again. One point that I want to stress is this is one round of funding for specific types of projects with the constraints that we established within the RFA. But appreciate the feedback and the information. But this RFA kind of is what it is, and in future RFAs we can use some of this information to help inform those.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, this is Vince Caristo from Mountain Line in Missoula.
Hi.
I have a question. Hey there, the requirement for scrapping the vehicle, we're kind of curious as to where that came from. I mean, for us, sometimes when we replace a vehicle, it makes more sense to move that vehicle from regular service into an emergency contingency service, so it's available for in the event of an emergency or a catastrophic situation. Is that at all allowed or definitely prohibited in this case?
Unfortunately, it's prohibited, and that is actually in the settlement. And scrapping, according to the definition of what scrapping means, is in the national settlement. So that can't be changed. And I think the goal there, and this is the same requirement for a DERA program on the scrapping, is that there's a guarantee that that vehicle is not on the road anymore.
Okay. If I could ask a second question, I mean, I've been tracking the discussion regarding the replacement requirements. At one point in the RFA on page 9, item A, you mentioned that we should use a useful life benchmark of 19 years for the transit bus. Does that mean that, say we have a 2006 vehicle that we're seeking to replace, does that mean we should use that same 19-year benchmark to determine when it would be expected to be replaced? So 2025, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, so those are two kind of different pieces. I know that they relate just because it relates to the age of the bus, but the one on the December 31st, 2022, that's the retirement policy for, in your case, Mountain Lion, and that could differ based on the entity. For the remaining useful life, that criteria, we came up with, the difference between the 19 years of age and the existing vehicle, to avoid, what was the intention there?
I thought it was an emissions, for emissions calculation purposes.
Yeah, I guess that's for the emissions calculation purposes. That's right. So yeah, that's an emissions calculation. The other one is the age of the bus.
Okay.
Or the retirement policy, sorry, of the bus. Yeah. Other questions? Well, I'm not seeing any come through in the chat box or not hearing anything else on the phone. Kind of give one last opportunity for questions over the phone, but if, as always, if there's questions, feel free to email myself or Bill Webb. There's still a month before the application deadline, so plenty of time for questions, and we'll try to address some of the questions around retirement policy and follow up on that as well. But are there any other burning questions out there? Okay, well, thanks everybody for your interest and participating in the webinar. Like I said, we will put the link to the recording on the Volkswagen mitigation website in the coming days, send out information about that. And if there's any updates or follow-up information, we'll also try to send those out before the March 27th deadline, and we look forward to your applications. Thank you.